If you want to understand the world we live in today, the wars being fought, the alliances being formed and broken, the technology races being run, the nuclear arsenals being built up, and the constant grinding competition for dominance over every corner of the globe, then you must first understand three nations: the United States of America, the People's Republic of China, and the Russian Federation. Because everything happening on the world stage right now, from the battlefields of Ukraine to the contested waters around Taiwan, from the race to dominate artificial intelligence to the dangerous new nuclear arms competition that began when the last major arms control treaty between the United States and Russia, the New START Treaty, expired on February 5, 2026, can be traced back to the history, power, and complex triangular relationship between these three countries. And to understand that, you have to go back to the beginning of the modern world order, which effectively began at the end of World War II, when the United States and the Soviet Union, the predecessor state to today's Russia, emerged from the rubble of that global catastrophe as the two dominant superpowers on Earth, beginning what historians would call the Cold War, a decades-long ideological, military, and political confrontation between American capitalism and Soviet communism that shaped the entire second half of the 20th century, dividing the world into two camps, fueling proxy wars across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and producing the most dangerous nuclear standoff in human history, a standoff that at its worst moments, particularly during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, came breathtakingly close to triggering a Third World War that would have ended civilization as we know it. China, meanwhile, had its own dramatic story unfolding during those same decades. The Communist Party under Mao Zedong had taken control of mainland China in 1949, and while China and the Soviet Union were initially ideological allies, that relationship fractured dramatically with what historians call the Sino-Soviet split of 1961, when deep ideological disagreements and personal rivalries between Mao and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev drove the world's two largest communist nations apart and brought them to the brink of actual military conflict, including a serious border clash in 1969 along the Ussuri River, a moment of history that most people today have completely forgotten, but which reshaped the entire global order by opening the door for a stunning diplomatic reversal that came in 1972, when U.S. President Richard Nixon made his historic visit to China and began the process of normalizing relations between Washington and Beijing, a move driven by cold strategic logic. If the United States could deepen its relationship with China, it could drive a permanent wedge between the two communist giants and tilt the balance of the Cold War decisively in America's favor. That strategy worked, and for the following 2 decades, the United States and China maintained a carefully managed relationship built on expanding trade and shared interest in containing Soviet power, until December 25, 1991, when the Soviet Union officially collapsed, its hammer and sickle flag lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, and the United States suddenly found itself in an entirely new world, the sole remaining superpower on Earth, a position of unrivaled global dominance that no nation had ever held before in the modern era, and one that American policymakers and strategists spent the next 3 decades trying to maintain. The Russia that emerged from the Soviet collapse was a shadow of its former self, economically devastated, politically chaotic, and deeply humiliated by the sudden loss of superpower status, while China, having launched its own market-oriented economic reforms under Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s, was quietly becoming something far more formidable than anyone in Washington had anticipated, growing at nearly 9% per year on average since 1990, joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, and steadily transforming itself from a poor, agrarian country into the world's largest manufacturer and second largest economy, a rise so rapid and so massive that it fundamentally altered the balance of global power and set the stage for the great power competition that now defines international affairs in the 2020s. To understand the real power of each of these 3 countries today, you have to look at the hard numbers, and those numbers tell a story that is both impressive and, in the case of Russia, increasingly alarming for Moscow. The United States in 2025 possesses the world's largest economy with a GDP of $30.62 trillion according to IMF data, the world's most powerful military as ranked by the Global Firepower Index with a power index score of 0.0741 that places it first out of 145 countries assessed, a defense budget of approximately $849.8 billion for fiscal year 2025. A figure so enormous that the United States alone accounts for 37% of all global military expenditure, according to SEPRI, meaning America spends more on its military than the next several major powers combined. and a nuclear arsenal of approximately 3,700 warheads as of January 2025, according to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, backed by a network of roughly 750 military bases spread across 80 foreign countries and territories, a global footprint of military power that no other nation comes remotely close to matching, and which gives the United States the ability to project force to virtually any corner of the planet within hours. China's power profile looks very different, but is growing at a pace that alarms American strategists more than any other single development in global affairs. China's GDP reached $19.4 trillion nominal terms in 2025, with the Chinese economy growing at 5.0% in 2025 and consistently ranking as one of the fastest-growing major economies in the world, a rate of expansion that, if sustained, will eventually make China's economy larger than America's in nominal dollar terms, potentially within the next decade. China's official defense budget reached nearly $247 billion in 2025, according to CSS, though analysts note that official Chinese figures routinely understate actual military expenditures, with real spending believed to be significantly higher. Most alarmingly, from a security perspective, China's nuclear stockpile reached approximately 600 warheads in 2025, more than doubling since 2019, according to CSIS data confirmed by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And in December 2024, in a development that sent shockwaves through the U.S. defense establishment, the Pentagon reported that China's People's Liberation Army launched several ICBMs in quick succession from a training center into the Western Pacific, in what was described as a significant demonstration of China's growing nuclear capability and ambition. China also launched the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013 under President Xi Jinping, an ambitious infrastructure and investment program that now spans more than 65 countries across Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America, giving Beijing enormous economic leverage and diplomatic influence across the developing world that it is steadily converting into geopolitical power. Russia, by contrast, presents a more complicated picture of power in decline in some dimensions, but still terrifyingly formidable in others. Russia possesses the world's largest nuclear arsenal by a significant margin, approximately 5,459 nuclear warheads in total as of 2025, according to the Federation of American Scientists, of which 1,618 are currently deployed, and Russia's strategic nuclear forces are assessed as 95% updated and modernized, which means that even as Russia's conventional military has been badly battered by 4 years of brutal, costly war in Ukraine, Russia retains an existential nuclear deterrent that makes any direct military confrontation with it unthinkable, and that nuclear arsenal is the foundation upon which Russia's continued claim to great power status rests. Russia's economy, however, tells a very different story, one of mounting strain and potential crisis. After growing at approximately 4% in both 2023 and 2024, driven largely by massive wartime government spending, Russia's GDP grew by only 1% in 2025, a figure that Russian President Vladimir Putin himself confirmed publicly, and The Economist described Russia's economy as having entered what it called the death zone, with the budget deficit in 2025 reaching 2.5% of GDP, 5 times higher than what was predicted at the beginning of the year, and the IMF forecasting growth of only 0.6 to 0.8% for 2025-2026, while Russia's energy revenues dropped by approximately a fifth in 2025 and manufacturing has been declining, a toxic economic combination that leads Le Monde and other serious analysts to warn that Russia's economy could fall into outright recession in 2026. Russia did export 238 million metric tons of oil in 2025, according to Reuters, with about 80% of those exports going to Asia, primarily China and India, as European markets have been largely cut off by sanctions, but the revenue from those exports is declining while the costs of the war continue to escalate. Now, perhaps the most important and overlooked story in all of contemporary geopolitics is the evolution of the relationship between these three countries, the triangle that holds the key to understanding where the world is heading. The United States and Russia are locked in what amounts to a new Cold War, made bitterly personal by Russia's February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the largest military assault in Europe since World War II, which prompted Washington to commit $66.9 billion in military assistance to Ukraine and mobilize a sweeping global sanctions regime against Moscow. But the most strategically significant relationship of our era is arguably between the United States and China, which by 2018 had escalated into what the U.S. National Defense University's strategic assessment explicitly described as fully acknowledged global great power rivalry, with Washington identifying Beijing as its primary long-term strategic competitor and both nations maneuvering across every possible arena, military, economic, technological, diplomatic, and ideological, for advantage in a competition that experts at geopolitical futures describe as one that will define the next generation of world affairs. The U.S. China trade war, which escalated dramatically in 2025 when the Trump administration imposed tariffs on Chinese goods that reached a peak of 145% before a temporary deal brought them back down to 10% each, illustrated just how deeply and dangerously intertwined the world's two largest economies have become, with the United States and China simultaneously being each other's biggest economic partners and each other's most feared strategic rivals, a paradox that makes this competition fundamentally different from and in many ways more dangerous than the original Cold War between America and the Soviet Union, which were much less economically connected. The China-Russia relationship, meanwhile, has been transformed since February 4, 2022, when China and Russia declared a dramatic no-limits strategic partnership just days before Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a partnership that has deepened steadily despite the Ukraine war, with Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin interacting an astonishing 19 times through in-person meetings or phone calls between February 2022 and February 2026, with China in October 2025 deepening its support for Russia's war effort through intelligence sharing, expanded drone supplies, and closer military cooperation, according to CFR analysis. China-Russia bilateral trade surged to a record $244 billion in 2024 before contracting by around 10% in 2025 to approximately $234 billion, and China has effectively become Russia's economic lifeline, serving as what energy analysts at Columbia University describe as Russia's buyer of last resort for oil and gas after Europe cut its dependence on Russian energy. In the new space and technology race, the power gap between China and Russia has become dramatic. In 2025, Russia managed only 17 space rocket launches, 5 times fewer than China, reflecting just how far Russia has fallen behind as a technology power while China races forward. China's DeepSeek AI model, released in early 2025, shocked the American technology establishment by demonstrating that China could produce world-class artificial intelligence that appeared to challenge the most sophisticated American models, despite U.S. chip export controls designed to prevent exactly that outcome. And in 2026, the Atlantic Council assesses that the United States will double down on exporting its AI technology stack as the cornerstone of its strategy to counter China's technological rise. On the military front, the situation around Taiwan has become increasingly tense, with China conducting military drills surrounding the island in January 2026, and Reuters reporting in February 2026 that China has been masking drone flights over the South China Sea in what analysts describe as a potential rehearsal for military operations against Taiwan, the self-governing island democracy that Beijing claims as its territory and has pledged to unify with the mainland by force if necessary, a confrontation that could draw the United States directly into open conflict with China under the terms of U.S. defense commitments to the island. Looking at what comes next, the picture is one of intensifying competition across multiple fronts simultaneously, with risks that experts rate as the highest they have been since the Cold War. The Eurasia Group, in its annual Top Risks report, identified the U.S. political revolution, meaning the Trump administration's dismantling of the post-World War II global order, as the single biggest risk of 2026, while the CFR's Foreign Policy Trends report notes that in 2026, the United States and Russia together hold 87% of all the world's nuclear weapons, and with the New START Arms Control Treaty having expired on February 5, 2026, both nations are now legally free to expand their nuclear arsenals without any treaty-based constraints for the first time in decades, a profoundly destabilizing development. Gallup polling found that U.S. leadership approval within NATO countries fell sharply in 2025, dropping 14 percentage points to just 21%, a historic low that reflects growing anxiety among America's closest allies about Washington's reliability and commitment to the alliances and institutions it built and led for 8 decades. China is advancing steadily toward President Xi Jinping's ambitious military modernization targets for 2027 and beyond, per the latest Pentagon annual report on China's military, and Beijing's 15th five-year plan covering 2026-2030 signals an acceleration of that military buildup that will further narrow the gap between Chinese and American military capabilities. Russia, despite its economic wounds and the catastrophic human cost of the Ukraine war, in which Russian forces have suffered nearly 1.2 million casualties according to CSIS, retains sufficient military capacity and political will to sustain its war in Ukraine through 2026 and beyond, according to assessments from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and still possesses the nuclear arsenal to make any direct confrontation with it potentially civilization-ending. What the world is witnessing in the early months of 2026 is nothing less than the remaking of the entire global order that has been in place since 1945, a world where American unipolarity, which defined the 3 decades after the Cold War, is giving way to a messier, more dangerous, and far less predictable multipolar world where the United States, China, and Russia are each pursuing their own visions for how the global order should be organized, visions that are fundamentally incompatible with one another, and the outcome of that three-way competition, whether it ends in war, in a new stable equilibrium, or in something no one has yet imagined, will determine the fate of every nation, every people, and every human being on Earth for generations to come.